The wax seal had cracked in the night cold, and when Beatrice Caro broke the flap with her thumb, the paper gave off that dry, bitter smell old documents have when they carry bad news into a poor kitchen. Dawn had not properly come up over the hill yet. The hearth was low, the flagstones held yesterday's chill, and a fine thread of wind slipped in around the window frame, as if even the house knew what the letter contained. She read it once standing, and then again sitting down because her knees had turned uncertain beneath her. The words were neat, merciless, and expensive. Arrears outstanding, payment due by midwinter, surrender of farm, house, and grazing if the sum remained unmet. It bore the name of Mr. Hallwick from the valley below, a man who had been buying land the way other men bought gloves, one pair after another, until they forgot the feel of the hand beneath. Outside, the yard was silver with frost. The U in the near pen stamped once and went still. From the buyer came the soft scrape of a hoof against old timber. Moss was waiting there, the half-blind moorland pony, lifting her rough little head as Beatrice entered, as though she had heard grief before it made a sound. One pale eye was clouded with age, the other steady enough. Her winter coat stood thick as lichen on stone. She smelled of hay, damp hide, and the hills themselves. "Do not look at me like that," Beatrice murmured, though the creature had done nothing but breathe. Her father had been dead 9 months. In that time she had sold silver, dismissed a maid, mended harness with linen thread, and learned how far a sack of meal might be stretched when pride was obliged to dine on arithmetic. But this was different. A bill could be postponed. A roof might wait another season. A foreclosure notice did not wait. Then came the knock at the back door, sharp in the morning stillness, and with it the first rumor of Duke Ezra of Stormont's revived ride to the sea, and a purse large enough to change the fate of one stubborn woman on one failing hill. If this kind of story is for you, do subscribe and stay with me, because Beatrice had not yet decided whether to laugh at the idea or saddle the pony. By noon, the rumor had taken on flesh and bone. Beatrice went down to the market with 2 small cheeses, a basket of turnips, and the letter folded inside her glove as if hiding it might lessen its weight. The village square smelled of wet wool, horse sweat, and wood smoke from the pie stall. Women bargained over onions. A drover cursed under his breath at a stubborn ram. Near the inn door, where notices were usually nailed for sales and parish business, a little knot of men had gathered beneath a fresh sheet of printed paper. It bore the Stormont crest at the top. Beneath it, in handsome black lines, was the Duke's proclamation. The old county race was to be revived within the fortnight, a hard run over the high ground, down through the western cut and on to the winter shore. The prize purse was named there, plain as daylight. Beatrice read the figure once, then again more slowly. It was enough. Enough to satisfy Hallwick. Enough to keep roof, byre, and grazing together for another year, if only it could be won. But the square had already decided what sort of contest it would be. Men spoke of blood horses from the valley, of gentlemen who rode with silver-mounted tack and servants at their heels. One name was repeated more than the rest. Adrian Vale, Mr. Hallwick's nephew, handsome, fearless, and sponsored for the day by the very man who held her debt. There was laughter in that, though no one laughed directly at her yet. They did not need to. The joke was already lying there between the lines. She sold her cheeses, counted the small coins into her purse, and should have gone home. Instead, she drifted closer to the inn window, where the rules had been posted beside the proclamation. Her breath clouded the glass. The words were formal, exact, and impossible to mistake. Any rider of the county might present themselves at Stormont stables and enter, provided they signed their own risk. Beatrice stood very still, her fingers cold around the handle of her basket, and for the first time that day she turned her mind, in earnest, toward Moss. She carried that thought all the way home. The lane climbed out of the village in a long, wet ribbon between black stone walls, and the air changed as she rose. The smell of smoke and people fell behind. Up here there was only peat, frost, and the clean, bitter scent of gorse after cold rain. By the time she reached the yard, her fingers were numb around the basket handle, yet her mind had grown almost painfully clear. A prize like that did not come twice to women in her circumstances. Perhaps it did not come twice to anyone. Moss was in the byre, nosing through hay with the patient industry of old creatures. Beatrice stood in the doorway for a moment and simply looked at her. The pony's back was broad and low, her mane rough as tow, her clouded eye turned a little away from the light. Nothing in that small, shaggy body suggested glory, and yet the hill had trusted those feet for years. In fog, in sleet, on thawing paths that would send a finer animal sliding, Moss had always found her way home. Beatrice set down the basket and ran her hand along the old mare's neck. The coat was thick and warm under her palm. "They would laugh themselves hoarse," she said softly. Moss chewed on, unmoved by the opinion of the county. After a while she climbed to the loft above the harness room and brought down what had once been her father's saddle. Dust rose from it in a dry little cloud. The leather was dark with age, the stitching frayed in two places, one stirrup slightly bent. She carried it into the yard, laid it across the mounting block, and began to test each strap with slow, careful fingers. If the thing could be mended, she would mend it. If it could be trusted one more day, she would ask it. The light was thinning when she heard hooves below the gate. Not the uncertain clatter of a farm cart, a well-bred horse, stepping high. Then came a man's voice from the lane, smooth and familiar. "Miss Caro, I trust I do not call at an inconvenient hour?" She knew the voice before she turned. Mr. Hallwick sat a dark bay gelding as comfortably as if the lane had been built for him alone. His coat was cut from heavy bottle-green cloth, his gloves pale and spotless, and even his horse seemed a little offended by the mud of the hill yard. Behind him the evening was going blue over the ridges. A faint smoke smell drifted from Beatrice's chimney, and somewhere in the byre Moss shifted her weight against the boards. "You do not," Beatrice said. He inclined his head, taking that answer as permission, and let his eye travel once around the place. It was a courteous glance, which made it worse. He saw the patched roof above the dairy, the leaning gate, the thin stack of turf by the wall. Men like Hallwick had a way of looking at hardship as if it were an entry in a ledger waiting to be settled. "I had occasion to ride this way," he said, "and I thought it only fair to ask whether my notice had caused you needless alarm." She almost smiled at that. "Foreclosure notices are not generally sent for comfort, sir." "No," he returned mildly, "but they are often sent in time to prevent greater difficulty." His gaze shifted toward the old saddle on the mounting block. "I understand there is much talk in the county of Stormont's revived race. One hears all sorts of fanciful resolutions made after market day." There it was, laid down as neatly as a knife. Beatrice rested one hand on the cracked leather. "If you have come to inquire after my resolutions, you have had your answer already. I mean to keep my farm. For your own sake, Miss Caro, I hope you will adopt a less romantic method." His voice softened further. "My nephew Adrian rides. He is very well mounted, very well backed, and very much expected to finish first. The purse will not fall by sentiment." She said nothing. Wind hissed through the dead grass along the wall. Hallwick leaned slightly in the saddle. "If you sign before midwinter, I can be generous. If you do not—" He let the sentence hang, then glanced toward the byre as Moss gave a low, homely snort. "You cannot mean to oppose blood and breeding with that little hill creature." Beatrice looked at him steadily. I mean, Mr. Hallwick, to oppose you with whatever is mine." For the first time, something colder than politeness passed through his face. "Then," he said, gathering the reins, "I shall look for you at Stormont, if only to admire your courage." After he had gone, the yard seemed quieter than before, and far less peaceful. Beatrice stood with one hand on the mounting block until the sound of Hallwick's horse had faded down the lane. The cold had sharpened while they spoke. A skin of ice was beginning to gather in the water trough, and the last light on the far ridge had gone from iron gray to blue. Inside the byre, Moss tore at hay with steady little jerks of the head, unconcerned by threats, purses, or gentlemen. That was perhaps the hardest part to bear. The pony had no notion that the whole poor farm now hung, absurdly enough, on whether those old feet could carry her through a county race. She took the saddle indoors and set it on the kitchen table beneath the lamp. The room smelled of hot tallow, damp wool, and the broth she had forgotten to finish. With an awl, coarse thread, and the last sound strap from an older harness, she began to mend what her father had once trusted. Her hands moved by habit. Her thoughts did not. They ran ahead to Stormont's start field, to polished boots, to the cold amusement of valley people who would see in her only a woman grown desperate enough to mistake endurance for speed. More than once she set the leather down and told herself it could not be done. Each time her eye fell on the folded notice beside the sugar bowl. At length she rose, fetched her father's riding coat from the press, and shook the dust from it. The cloth was faded at the seams, the cuffs shiny with wear, and one button had been replaced years ago with horn. She laid it over a chair to air by the fire. Then she went back to the byre with a lantern and a small measure of oats saved against harsher weather. "Come then," she said quietly. Moss lifted her head at once. Beatrice slipped on a bridle, led her into the moon-pale yard, and, with no witness but the frost and the sheep beyond the wall, put a foot in the old stirrup and gathered the reins. If the county meant to laugh, let it laugh at something that had first been tried upon the hill. The pony did not hesitate. Moss stepped out of the yard as if the moonlit slope belonged to her in the same old, unquestioned way the byre did. Frost crackled under the small iron shoes. The lane soon gave up its little pretense of order and narrowed into the rough hill track, where stones thrust through the earth and the ruts held thin ribbons of black water. Beatrice kept a light hand on the rein. There was no sense in forcing what the creature already knew better than she did in darkness. The night had a hard, listening stillness to it. Far off, a curlew cried once across the moor. The wind carried the sharp taste of snow from the high ground, though the stars still burned clear above the ridge. Moss went on with her head slightly lowered, choosing each place for her feet with an old worker's care. Twice Beatrice thought the track had vanished beneath shadow and frost, and twice the pony found it again without fuss, turning where the safe line ran and slowing of her own accord at a patch of loose shale. That was the first comfort Beatrice had felt since the notice came. She rode higher than she usually dared after dusk, up toward the north shoulder where the sheep paths crossed the open slope. There her father had once taught her to read the land by feel as much as sight. A wet hollow kept colder air. Heather hid a drop where the earth had slipped. Snow, when it came, always drifted first against the old boundary stones. She had learned those things young, then buried them beneath years of worry and account-keeping. On Moss's back, with the cold stinging her face and the dark spread wide around her, some of it returned. When at last she turned for home, she did not feel hopeful exactly, but she no longer felt foolish. The next morning brought clearer weather and a smaller, meaner necessity. If the mare was to stand any chance at Stormont, she would need better feed than the farm could spare. So Beatrice wrapped her shawl close, took the silver-backed hairbrush that had belonged to her mother from the top drawer of the chest, and set out once more for the village. The hairbrush lay heavy in her pocket all the way down the lane. It had belonged to her mother, and there had been a time when its silver back shone on the dressing table of a room now closed against damp and want. Beatrice kept her hand over it as she walked, as if warmth might turn it back into something not yet chosen for sale. The morning was raw. Thin ice clung to puddles in the cart ruts, and the hedges wore a brittle white edge where the frost had bitten them first. The village shop took in small valuables as well as flour and lamp oil. Mrs. Peebles, who kept the place, said nothing foolish when Beatrice placed the brush upon the counter. She only fetched her spectacles, looked at the worn monogram, and named a modest sum with more kindness than profit in it. Beatrice accepted. Pride had long since become too costly a luxury for daily use. With the coins, she bought oats, a little coarse meal, and a fresh length of leather for the girth. While Mrs. Peebles wrapped the strap, two men near the door were speaking of Stormont. One had come from the lower road that morning and had seen horse boxes, grooms, and saddlers arriving already. The Duke, he said, meant the thing to be splendid. The other laughed and named the likely winner before the start had even been called. Adrian Vale, of course. Holwick had spared no expense. "A pretty enough race," the man said, "though it will be over for most before the sea can smell them." On the counter beside the scales lay a printed handbill, its edge held down with a jar of peppermints. Beatrice glanced at it while Mrs. Peebles counted change. The crest was Stormont's again. Beneath the rules stood the list of patrons and sponsors. Ezra, Duke of Stormont, first among them, and lower down, in smaller ink yet plain enough, Mr. Holwick of Mere Valley. That settled something in her more finally than the purse had done. She loaded the oats onto the borrowed handcart and turned homeward before noon, the cold air reddening her cheeks. By the time the hill came back into view, her course was fixed. At first light, she would ride to Stormont stables, give her name, and let the whole county think what it pleased. She slept little that night. Before dawn, the kitchen was black but for the lamp, and the cold had such a bite in it that the wash water filmed over at the rim of the basin. Beatrice dressed by touch more than sight, pinned up her hair, and put on her father's old coat over two wool gowns. In the yard, moss stood ready beneath a skin of frost, breath rising soft and white into the dark. The new leather strap creaked when Beatrice tightened it. That sound, small as it was, seemed to commit her more firmly than any vow. The road to Stormont took longer on a pony's measured step than it would have on a finer horse, yet she did not hurry the mare. Morning opened slowly around them. The eastern sky paled to pearl behind the hills, and then the great house came into view beyond its sheltering trees, all gray stone, chimneys, and ordered grandeur. Even the lower stables were larger than her byre and dairy together. Men moved there in brisk lines through the steam of horses and the sharp smell of leather soap, oats, and clean straw. She had known, of course, that she would look poor among them. Knowing it did not soften the moment. The yard was bright with chestnuts, bays, and sleek, dark hunters, their coats burnished, their bridles silvered, their riders wrapped in excellent cloth. A groom carrying a polished saddle paused to stare openly at Moss. Another looked away too quickly, which was almost worse. Beatrice kept her chin level and rode to the registration table set beneath the stable arch. A steward in the Duke's colors asked her name, then lifted his eyes to the pony and paused. Quill still in hand, he repeated it to be certain he had heard correctly. "Miss Carow, from Highfell Farm?" "Yes." Before he could say more, laughter stirred somewhere behind her. Light laughter, careful laughter, the sort that wished to be overheard. Then the little sound died all at once, as if a door had shut on it. A man had entered the yard from the inner stable passage, and without needing to ask, Beatrice knew she was looking at Duke Ezra of Stormont. He was younger than rumor had made him. Duke Ezra came into the stable yard without flourish, though everything about him altered the air at once. He wore dark riding clothes, so plain in cut that only their quality marked them, and he moved with the spare assurance of a man accustomed to obedience. One groom straightened, another removed his cap. Even the horses nearest the arch seemed to settle under the force of his attention. He looked first to the table, then to the line of riders beyond it, and only then to Beatrice and Moss. His gaze halted there. For the space of a breath, perhaps two, he simply took them in. The worn coat, the old saddle, the pony with her rough winter mane and one clouded eye. There was no open smile on his face, no spoken insult. That would have been easier to bear. What crossed his expression was briefer and colder than laughter. Surprise, certainly. Then disbelief. Then the quick, inward amusement of a man who thinks he has encountered an absurdity before breakfast. The steward cleared his throat. "Miss Caro of Highfell Farm, Your Grace. She desires to enter." Ezra stepped nearer. His boots rang once on the stone. Up close, his eyes were darker than she had expected, and very direct. "Do you understand the length of the course, Miss Caro?" "I do." "And the ground?" "At least as well as any man who has not had to earn his bread upon it." That answer caused the faintest stir among the listeners. Adrian Vale, mounted a little way off on his gleaming chestnut, let out a low breath of amusement and turned it into a cough. Hallwick's nephew looked every inch the favorite, trait-backed, polished, and perfectly aware of being observed. The Duke's mouth changed, though not into a smile. "This is no pageant," he said. "The ride is severe even in fair weather." Beatrice kept her hands quiet on the rein. "Then it is fortunate, Your Grace, that I have not come for ornament." Something in the yard tightened after that. Ezra glanced once toward the open sky above the stable roofs. The morning had brightened, yet beyond the eastern pale there hung a band of thickening gray, low and woolly against the hills. When he looked back at her, his tone had gone formal as iron. "If you enter," he said, "you do so on your own judgment." And then he waited before the whole yard to hear whether she would say yes. She did not keep him waiting. "Yes, Your Grace," Beatrice said, and her own voice sounded calmer than she felt. "On my own judgment." The steward lowered his eyes at once and wrote her name into the book. Ink scratched across the page with dreadful finality. Somewhere behind her a groom coughed into his sleeve to hide a laugh, and Adrian Vale shifted in the saddle with the easy satisfaction of a man who had just seen a wager improve itself. Yet Moss stood as she always stood, square and quiet, ears turning toward the sounds of the yard without alarm. If the pony felt herself absurd, she gave no sign of it. Ezra inclined his head, though there was nothing approving in the gesture. "Very well. The field assembles at first light 2 days hence. Keep to the marked course. If weather turns, the marshal's flags will govern the line." "Thank you, Your Grace." He would have moved on then, perhaps glad to return to riders whose presence asked less of his patience, but his glance strayed once more to the mare. He noticed, as any horseman must, the milky cast in one eye and the winter stiffness in the joints. His expression hardened with something near irritation, not at her perhaps, but at the necessity of allowing folly under his own name. Adrian rode nearer before the Duke had fully stepped away. "Miss Caro means to give us all a lesson in country economy," he said lightly. "A single pony doing the work of a stable." A ripple of laughter answered him. Beatrice looked at him at last. He was handsome in the bright, shallow way some men are, all excellent teeth and easy scorn. "Then I hope, Mr. Vale, your stable has taught you not to spend yourself too early." That landed. Not loudly, but enough. Adrian's smile thinned. The Duke heard it too. She saw that in the brief turn of his head. He said nothing in her defense, and yet neither did he permit Vale another word. Instead, he called for the next rider, and the little court of grooms and gentlemen opened around him as if drawn by a tide. Beatrice signed the register, turned Moss toward the gate, and might have gone with some fragment of dignity intact, had she not heard the Duke, just before she passed beyond the arch, give one quiet order to his chief marshal. "Set extra men on the western ridge," Ezra said. "That sky has snow in it." That warning rode home with her more stubbornly than the laughter had. The day before the race passed in the plain, hard labor of preparation. Beatrice did not try to make Moss finer. There was no polishing that little beast into something she was not, and she had too much sense for vanity. Instead, she rubbed her down till the shaggy coat lay cleaner, checked the hooves for loose stones, and fed her the last of the better oats with a care that bordered on reverence. The old mare's muzzle was soft against her sleeve, and her one clear eye followed every movement with quiet trust. Inside the house, Beatrice laid out what she would wear: her father's coat, her stoutest wool stockings, gloves already thinned at the fingers, a scarf wound twice over at the throat. On the table beside these things lay a crust of bread, a little cheese, and a flask she meant to fill before dawn. Such were the provisions of a woman going to contend for her whole future against men who would travel with grooms and spare cloaks. Yet there was something almost solemn in the small order of it. She was not dressing for display. She was equipping herself to endure. Toward evening the sky altered. The light over the hills turned flat and pewter-colored, and the rooks flew low across the west pasture. Even the sheep drew inward along the wall, uneasy before weather not yet felt. Beatrice climbed the rise behind the byre and stood there with her skirts whipping at her boots, reading the land as she had been taught. Snow, yes, though whether it would hold off till night or break sooner she could not tell. Down at Stormont, Ezra was making his own observations. He had spent part of the afternoon riding sections of the lower course with his marshal, confirming crossings and checking the state of the western track. He told himself that his concern was for the field at large, and in part it was. Yet more than once, against his own preference, his mind returned to the woman on the rough pony. Her entry had offended his judgment. It had also disturbed it. Folly was usually noisier than that. At dusk, as Beatrice banked the kitchen fire and set the flask by the door, someone knocked once on the outer gate. When she opened it, she found not Hallwick this time, but a stable lad from Stormont, breathless from the climb, holding out a folded paper sealed with the Duke's crest. The lad's cheeks were scarlet from the climb, and the paper in his hand had gone a little damp at the edges. "From Miss Caro," he said, touching his cap. "From Stormont." Beatrice broke the seal beneath the lantern by the gate. The message inside was brief, written in a clerk's neat hand rather than the Duke's own. Riders were to present themselves half an hour earlier than first announced. Weather over the western heights was judged uncertain. All entrants were reminded that they rode at their own hazard and might still withdraw before the flag fell. Nothing in it was personal. Nothing in it needed to be. Yet the very fact of the note reaching her lonely hill farm after dusk made her stand still a moment in the cold. She thanked the boy and gave him the last heel of oatcake from the shelf. When he had gone, she read the paper once more by the firelight. Withdraw. The words sat on the page like a small, respectable invitation to save herself from disgrace. She fed the folded note to the flames and watched the crest blacken, curl, and vanish. Before dawn the next morning, the world held that strange, muffled quiet which comes before weather decides itself. Frost glazed the yard boards. The bucket rope had stiffened in the night. Beatrice filled her flask, tucked bread and cheese into her pocket, and fastened the old coat with fingers that would not quite steady. Moss took the bit without fuss. When Beatrice laid her forehead for one instant against the pony's rough neck, the mare smelled of warm hide, hay, and clean, cold air. Stormont was already awake when they arrived. Lamps burned gold through the stable windows, and the start field beyond the lower lawns was crowded with horses stamping steam into the dim morning. Carriages lined the drive. Gentlemen sat bright and straight in the saddle. Ladies, wrapped in fur and velvet, watched from rugs and cushions as if hardship were a spectacle arranged for their pleasure. The sea wind reached even here, carrying salt under the stable smell. Then the crowd parted near the front, and Duke Ezra rode out on a dark horse to address the field. Beatrice gathered her reins, lifted her chin, and guided Moss forward into full view. The laughter began near the front and traveled outward in little careful ripples. No one wished to be coarse in the Duke's presence. That would have been bad form. But a woman needed no raised voice to know when she had become a spectacle. Beatrice felt the turn of heads, the narrowed eyes, the bright, assessing amusement. Velvet hoods shifted in the carriages. A gentleman near the rail lifted his glass, looked directly at Moss, and lowered it again with a smile for his companion. Even the horses seemed to know the difference between themselves and the shaggy creature from the hill. Yet the pony walked on, patient as weather. Ezra reined in at the head of the field and gave the short formal address expected of him. He spoke of county custom restored, of stamina, judgment, and the honor of a hard course honestly ridden. His voice carried easily in the cold morning air. Beatrice, listening from the outer edge, thought there was nothing light in him when he addressed the field as a whole. Whatever else he might be, he took responsibility seriously. That made his earlier look harder to forget. When he finished, the riders settled into their places. Adrian Vale drew up on the favored chestnut as if the day had been arranged for his convenience. Hallwick stood with the patrons near the ropes, gloved hands folded over the head of his cane, watching everything with that same dry composure. He saw her, inclined his head once, and looked away again. He did not need to gloat. The whole assembled county was doing it for him. The marshals moved down the line with final instructions. One checked girths. Another pointed the first turn beyond the lower meadow. A huntsman's horn would have been too theatrical for this older custom, so the start would be given by flag and pistol together. Around them, the winter fields lay pale beneath a thin crust of frost. Beyond the lower rise, the moor climbed dark and open toward the west. Beatrice bent and touched Moss's neck. The hair was thick beneath her glove, the muscle warm and steady. "Only keep your feet," she murmured. Then, from somewhere above the stables, a gull cried on the sea wind, and the Duke raised his arm for the start. The flag dropped, the pistol cracked, and the whole field surged forward in a thunder of hooves. For a moment, Beatrice saw nothing but flying clods, streaming manes, and the hard, bright backs of riders already intent on outshining one another. Moss gave a startled toss of the head at the noise, then settled beneath her as soon as the first rush had passed. Beatrice let the others go. There would be no wisdom in forcing that little body to contend with thoroughbreds on the first rise. She kept to a steady pace, the reins light, her weight low and quiet, while the field stretched ahead in color and speed. Some laughed as they passed her. One gentleman saluted with his crop. Adrian Vale did not bother to look back. He had his eye on the Duke and the leading cluster, where the best horses were already lengthening into that smooth, costly stride bred for admiration as much as distance. Ezra rode among them with the easy command of a man who expected his mount to answer and the ground to permit. The first miles crossed lower pasture and then open climbing turf where frost still clung in white seams to the grass. Moss's shorter stride covered less ground, but she spent nothing foolishly. Beatrice knew this part of the country. The hill looked simple from below, yet the land here had a habit of hiding hollows under heather and soft places beneath a bright crust. Twice she saw riders cut a clean, proud line only to jar sharply where the earth dipped under them. She chose differently. A little left at the stone outcrop, a little wider where dark rushes marked wet ground. Once, at a shallow drainage slit, she let Moss step down and up where finer horses tried to fly it. Behind the leaders, the field had already begun to sort itself. Vanity went fastest. Sense followed later. Ezra glanced back only once on that first climb, more from the habit of measuring his field than from any concern for her. He saw the shabby rider far to the rear, still mounted, still stubbornly present, and dismissed the sight almost at once. Until the course bent toward the high western ridge, and the first cold gust hit them full in the face with the taste of snow in it. The weather turned with shocking speed. One moment the ridge lay ahead in hard winter light, every stone and tuft of heather etched clear against the pale sky. The next, the wind came down in a single bitter sweep, sharp enough to make the horses fling their heads and the riders lower their faces into their collars. Snow began as a few dry grains striking cheek and glove. Then another gust drove a whole white veil across the course. Ezra felt the change at once. His dark horse bunched beneath him, eager still, but less certain now, feeling what the air had become before many of the riders did. He called to the nearest marshal, pointed toward the western line, and signaled for the flags to be held higher if they could. It was sound judgment, though already the first ranks were too extended to be easily governed. The field had lengthened over the climb, and pride had carried several gentlemen farther forward than sense ought to have allowed. Behind them, Beatrice shortened her hold on the reins and let Moss choose more of the way. This was where a fine horse might betray itself. The ground on the upper moor did not forgive ignorance. Snow fell into the hollows first and disguised them. Heather tufted over broken peat. Old sheep tracks, invisible to the eye now, still ran firm beneath the crust if one knew how they bent around stone and water. Moss lowered her head and traveled by some older knowing than sight. One ear turned to the wind, one to her rider, feet setting down with grave little certainties. Ahead, trouble began in earnest. A chestnut on the left skidded at a buried rut and nearly unseated its master. Another rider, trying to press past, hauled too sharply and lost a stirrup. The bright order of the field broke into scattered motion, men shouting, horses blowing hard, snow cutting across them all. Adrian Vale, still intent on the lead, drove his mount onward with more ambition than prudence. Ezra looked back once through the whitening air, searching his own course markers, and caught sight of something he had not expected to see at all. Far behind, where the finer horses were already dancing and disputing the ground, the shabby rider on the little hill pony was still coming on, steady, straight, and frighteningly sure. That sight stayed with him longer than it ought to have done. Ezra had no leisure to dwell on it. The ridge was vanishing by degrees. Snow drove slantwise across the open ground, whitening mane and sleeve and turning distance into guesswork. A marshal's red flag showed for a moment on the next rise, then blurred and was gone. Horses that had met the lower fields like dancers now labored and tossed, feeling danger under the crusted surface where their riders saw only whiteness. Adrian Vale still pressed on, jaw set, seat hard, one gloved hand low over the neck of his chestnut. He wanted the lead too badly to surrender it to weather. Ezra saw him take a line slightly east of the safer rise, straight into country that looked smooth and was nothing of the kind. He called out once, but the wind tore the warning thin. Behind them, Beatrice had ceased to think of rivals at all. There was only the slope, the drift, and the feel of moss beneath her. The little mare's ears moved, then steadied. Her head went lower. She shortened of her own accord where snow had begun to bridge the hollows. Beatrice let her do it. This was the oldest lesson of the hills. When a beast bred to the land speaks through her feet, a wise rider listens. To her right, one gentleman's bay plunged chest-deep into a hidden soft place and came out blowing foam, wild-eyed and furious. Another rider hauled too sharply and slid sideways, boots scraping at nothing before he recovered. Somewhere ahead, a woman cried out. The sound vanished almost at once. Ezra's horse struck firmer ground, then broke through at the next stride. The stallion recovered with strength to spare, but it shook him. He checked, scanned, and saw the field no longer as a pageant of sport, but as scattered lives on bad country. Again his gaze went back, almost against his will, to that unlikely figure on the hill pony. She was no longer merely enduring. She was reading the moor. Then, through the white confusion ahead, came the ugly sound every rider knows at once: stone giving way under iron, followed by a horse's frightened scream. The cry came again, closer now, and then, out of the white, drove a riderless horse with foam at its bit and terror in its eye. It was not Adrian's chestnut. This was a bay mare from farther back in the field, one Beatrice remembered seeing in the lower pasture beneath a gentleman in a plum-colored coat. The mare blundered past, saddle skewed, one stirrup leather flapping wildly against her side. Beyond her, half hidden by blown snow, a dark shape moved on the ground near a scatter of broken stones where an old boundary line had given way. Beatrice checked moss at once. There are moments, if you have ever been on difficult country, when choice scarcely feels like choice at all. She could not ride past a fallen man as if he were no more than a marker on the course. She turned the pony downwind toward him. Moss picked her path over the broken ground with maddening calm, slipping between stone and drift where a larger horse would have fought the footing. The rider had come off hard, but fortune had spared him the worst. He was winded, shaken, and far more offended than injured. Snow clung to his coat sleeves. One knee had struck the stones badly enough to make him curse through his teeth when Beatrice reached him. "Can you stand?" she asked. "With assistance, madam," he said, recognizing only that a rider had stopped. Then he looked up and truly saw her, and astonishment interrupted his misery. "Good God! It is the lady from the pony." "It is," she said. "Now take hold." She got him to his feet, steadied him until another marshal came stumbling through the drift, and did not waste another second. Her hands were already numb, her skirts wet through at the hem, and the race was moving on without her. Yet when she remounted, there was no panic in her, only concentration. Far ahead, Ezra had seen enough to know what had happened. She had halted to help where other riders had pressed on. It was a foolish loss of time in a race driven by debt and pride, and yet, against reason, his respect for her sharpened. Then the wind shifted once more, opened a ragged lane through the snow, and showed him something worse than a fallen rider. The course ahead crossed a peat shelf he had meant the field to skirt, and Adrian Vale was driving straight toward it. Ezra shouted, but the storm took half the word from his mouth. Adrian either did not hear him or chose not to. The chestnut, maddened by cold and driven too hard, was no longer reading its footing at all. It was obeying the hand on its rein and the urgency in the man above it. That was the peril of proud horses and prouder riders. They could be magnificent in good going. On treacherous land, magnificence was often only a more elegant form of disaster. The peat shelf lay under a skin of snow, treacherously smooth. Ezra knew it from drier seasons, a place where water had once eaten the ground away beneath the heather. Safe passage ran to the left, where the slope rose over stone. Adrian cut right for the shorter line. The chestnut vanished to the knee at once, lunged free, and nearly pitched him. The young man swore and hauled harder, trying to force speed where the ground demanded humility. Ezra saw the second lunge coming before it happened and drove his own horse across the slope to intercept if he could. But the dark stallion, strong as he was, struck a buried lip of peat, scrambled, and lost his own line for one sickening instant. Behind them, Beatrice had seen enough. She did not call out. There was no use. Instead, she pressed moss toward the higher shoulder, where the drift thinned around a ridge of old stone. The pony took it at once, ears flat now, feet placing with fierce little precision. Snow slapped at Beatrice's face. Her skirts were soaked through to the thigh. Yet her mind had narrowed to the shape of the ground ahead and the two men blundering into it. Adrian's horse broke free by terror alone and veered down slope, rider half out of the saddle. He disappeared into the white to the east, alive for the moment, and no longer her concern. It was the Duke she saw next. Ezra's stallion had recovered once, then failed at the second footing. The earth beneath the snow gave way in a dark, sucking collapse. Horse and rider went down together at the edge of a hidden peat hag, and when the gilded silence after the struggle came, only the horse surged up again. The saddle was empty. For one suspended instant, all Beatrice saw was the horse. Ezra's dark mount came lunging out of the snow with the wild-eyed look of an animal that had felt the ground open under it and escaped by panic rather than judgment. The reins trailed. One stirrup banged against the saddle flap. Then the horse vanished down slope into the storm, leaving only churned snow, black peat, and the deep, ragged mark where weight had broken through the crust. Beatrice was off moss before the pony had quite halted. "Stand!" she said, and the little mare stood. The peat hag was half hidden under snow and worse than water for a fallen man. Ezra had gone into it shoulder first, one arm buried, one knee twisted beneath him. The cold of it struck like iron through cloth. He was conscious, barely. When he tried to free himself, the bog sucked harder at him, and the effort spent what warmth remained. Snow clung to his dark hair. His face had gone almost gray beneath the weather. "Your Grace?" She dropped to one knee at the edge, testing the ground before she put more weight on it. "Do not struggle." His eyes opened properly then, fixed on her, and for a moment he did not speak at all. It was not merely surprise. It was the dazed, unwilling recognition of a man forced to understand that his safety now depended upon the very rider he had judged least fit for the course. "You," he said at last, his voice rough with cold. "Yes." There was no time for dignity beyond the necessary kind. She slid farther forward, braced one boot against a stone, and caught hold of his coat where the cloth would hold. "Can you move your left arm?" "With pain." "That will suffice." Moss waited above them, head lowered into the driving snow, as steady as if she had been tied to a stable post. Ezra saw her then, the small, rough beast, half-blind, unshaken, and something altered in his expression even through the shock. The moor had stripped the county's laughter clean away. There was only fact now. The pony had kept her feet. The Duke had not. Beatrice hauled once, then again. He came free by inches, black peat staining sleeve and collar. When at last she got him onto firmer ground, she looked at the deepening drift, at the useless open country around them, and understood the difficulty in full. He could not walk out of this alone, and she could not leave him here to freeze. The truth of it settled between them with brutal clarity. Ezra tried to rise and failed at once. His right leg would bear a little, then buckle under him with a sick weakness that told its own story. Not broken, Beatrice thought, but badly wrenched and already stiffening in the cold. He knew it, too. The wind had gone under his coat. Peat water darkened him to the waist. His hands, even in gloves, were beginning to lose obedience. "You must go on," he said, though the words came with effort. "There will be marshals behind." "There may," she answered, "or they may be looking for someone else by now." Snow hissed across the slope. Moss stood above them, patient, blowing softly through her nose as if waiting for instructions she trusted would arrive in due course. Beatrice measured the ground, the lowering day, the weight of a grown man, and the mile or more, perhaps less, perhaps more, to the old shepherd's bothy she remembered on the lee side of the next shoulder. If the roof still held, it would do. If it had gone, she would need another answer. Ezra followed her gaze to the pony and gave a short, disbelieving breath that might have been the ghost of a laugh under other circumstances. You cannot mean to put me on that creature. I mean to keep you alive, your grace. There was no argument after that. Pride is a costly thing on warm carpets. On a winter moor, it becomes absurd. Beatrice drew Moss closer, speaking low into the rough mane. The mare came at once, stepping delicately to the edge of the firm ground, ears pricked, neither shying from the fallen duke nor fussing at his scent of fear and bog water. Ezra watched her with narrowed eyes, and for the first time he saw not a comic little animal, but a working beast of uncommon nerve. Getting him mounted was ugly work. He could help some, though not much. Twice he nearly slipped back into the drift. Once Beatrice had to brace her shoulder under his arm and take most of his weight herself, boots sliding in the snow, breath burning in her throat. When at last she managed to settle him sideways across the saddle and seize the rein, Moss took one careful step forward, as if to tell them both she understood. From that moment, the way forward belonged to the pony. Beatrice did not attempt the open line of the course any longer. The race, the flags, the scattered riders somewhere in the storm, all that fell away before the simpler demand of keeping one injured man upright and breathing. She took Moss by the rein and let the mare choose the safest footing along the higher shoulder, where old stone and buried sheep paths gave a little firmness under the snow. Ezra, half draped and half seated, clenched his jaw whenever the pony shifted beneath him, yet he made no complaint. Pain had stripped him of every unnecessary word. The wind was less savage once they gained the lee of the slope, but the cold seemed to deepen there. Snow gathered in the folds of Ezra's coat and melted darkly where the peat had already soaked through. More than once his head dipped forward, and each time Beatrice spoke sharply to keep him from yielding to that treacherous drowsiness. "Stay awake, your grace." "I am awake." "Then prove it." A faint breath of something passed over his mouth then, almost amusement and not quite. "You command very briskly for one of your station, Miss Caro." "I command where the ground permits it." Even through his pain he heard the rebuke in that, and for once he accepted it without resistance. They went on slowly, Beatrice leading, Moss bearing the awkward double burden with that same grave patience she had shown all day. The wind softened by small degrees as they dropped behind the shoulder of the hill. Snow still flew, but no longer with the full violence of the open ridge. Shapes began to return to the world, an outcrop of black stone, a run of bent grass showing through the drift, the broken stump of an old boundary post. Each thing came to Beatrice like a remembered word. She had passed this way in lambing season years ago. If memory held, the bothy could not be far. "It should stand below us," she said, more to herself than to him. "You know every inch of this country," Ezra murmured. "I know enough not to quarrel with it." At length Moss stopped of her own accord and lifted her head. Ahead, half buried under blown snow, a low dark shape pressed into the hillside showed itself, 3 walls of old stone, a leaning roof patched with turf, and a door hanging crooked but still fastened. Relief hit Beatrice so sharply her knees nearly failed her. Getting him down from the saddle was worse than getting him up. By the time she had him inside, her gloves were soaked and her arms trembled with fatigue. The bothy smelled of old smoke, damp stone, and the faint dry sweetness of heather once used for bedding. There was no comfort in it, only shelter, but shelter was enough. She found a little stack of peat and kindling left by some shepherd's mercy, struck flame with numbed fingers, and coaxed a stingy fire to life. Ezra sat against the wall, pale and shivering, watching her through the first wavering light. "Miss Caro," he said quietly, "you must not lose the race on my account." She turned then, the fire catching the strain in her face. "If I do not finish, Mr. Hallwick takes my farm at midwinter." For the first time he understood the full measure of what had driven her onto the course, and when he spoke next, his voice had changed. "Then you must ride on." The words struck her harder than the wind had, For a moment, Beatrice only stared at him across the poor little fire, its smoke creeping up the cracked stones and out through some old gap in the roof. Outside, snow still rasped against the bothy wall. Inside, there was the smell of damp wool, peat, and the bitter metal scent of cold water drying on his coat. He sat upright now, by force of will alone, one hand braced against the floor, his face pale but clearer than it had been on the hill. "If I leave you—" "You leave me under shelter," Ezra said, "with fire, with time enough for my men to find me once the weather eases." He drew a breath that cost him something. "If you stay, you lose your farm for the sake of a duke who was fool enough to trust speed over ground." She almost answered that no man ought to speak of himself so plainly. But the plainness was what moved her. There was no pride left in him now, no host's amused distance, no rank to shelter behind. Only the truth. Beatrice knelt and poured the last of the broth from her flask into the cup she had found on a ledge blackened with soot. He drank because she told him to. After that, she pulled a folded horse blanket from the corner where some shepherd had left it and settled it over his legs. When she rose, her own limbs felt heavy as timber. "I know the lower line from here," she said. "There is a sheep track that comes out above the old quarry road." Ezra looked at her with a steadiness she had not seen before. "And you know it in snow?" "Yes." "Of course you do." That faint note in his voice was not mockery. It was respect. And because it came too late to serve convenience, it meant more than an earlier kindness might have done. He reached inside his coat, drew out his signet ring with stiff fingers, and held it toward her. "If anyone contests your account when you arrive," he said, "show them this." Beatrice hesitated, then took it. The metal was cold in her palm. A few minutes later, she stood again in the whitening doorway, moss waiting beyond like a patient shadow. Behind her, the Duke said, very quietly, "Miss Caro, win it." She mounted, turned the pony toward the buried western track, and rode back into the storm with dusk beginning to gather over the sea. She did not answer him with words. Beatrice only closed the bothy door against the wind, set her face toward the west, and let moss take the slope. The storm had spent its worst rage by then, though daylight was already failing. Snow lay in long, torn veils across the lower ground, and the world had gone very quiet after so much shouting and fear. Here and there she passed the broken signs of the field, a dropped glove, a snapped crop, hoof marks turned back toward Stormont, but no rider came abreast of her. By the time the sea showed itself at last, a strip of dull silver beneath the cloud, she knew she was alone. At the finish, the crowd had shrunk to knots of anxious people gathered near braziers and carriage lamps. Most believed the race half ruined by weather. Some argued that no proper result could be declared at all. Hallwick stood with the officials, composed as ever, until a murmur rose from the road above the shore and every head turned. Out of the blue evening came the little hill pony, crusted with salt, snow, and peat, carrying Beatrice straight-backed in her father's old coat. She crossed the line without flourish, almost too spent to understand what the silence meant. Then the starter, after one stunned look at the empty road behind her, raised his hand and named her first. Hallwick recovered quickly enough to smile. He offered, before witnesses, to purchase the pony at once for a handsome sum, and when she refused, he offered for the farm itself, as though generosity had ever been his intention. Beatrice took the purse in one hand, the Duke's ring in the other, and said, very clearly, "Neither is for sale, sir." That was when Ezra arrived, pale and limping, supported by two marshals and much altered in the eyes of those who had watched him at dawn. He did not let anyone soften the truth. He told them she had pulled him from the bog, brought him to shelter, and still ridden on. Then, before all of them, he turned to her and said, "Miss Caro, when my leg mends, you must teach me how to cross my own land properly." The tide was coming in by then, folding itself over the dark sand in long, quiet lines. Moss lowered her head to the wind, as if none of it had ever been remarkable, and the surf kept its own counsel. If you would like, leave me a word below and stay subscribed. There are more stories yet to tell.